Weldon testified before a House Oversight Committee about the recall of over 135 million bottles of infant and children's medicines earlier this year. He's joined by the FDA's Principal Deputy Commissioner. This was the second hearing the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee has held on the recall. It's 2 hours, 15 minutes.
Committee will come to order. Johnson & Johnson's recall of children's Tylenol and other children's medicines and the phantom recall of Motrin. Good morning and thank you all for being here. This is our second hearing on disturbing recall of children's medicine by Johnson & Johnson. At our first hearing, we learned that J&J's April the 30th recall of children's Tylenol, children's Motrin, children's Benadryl, and Tylenol infants drops was the largest recall of children's medicine in history. More than 135 million bottles of children's medicines were recalled. We also learned that there wasn't just one recall. We heard testimony about rolling recalls, a phantom recall, a plant shutdown, and management firings since then. We have obtained additional documents which raise troubling questions about both the accuracy of J&J's earlier testimony and the extent of the phantom recall. When Johnson & Johnson learned it had a problem with one of its adult Motrin products in 2008 and 2009, the company hired contractors to go into stores and buy the product off the shelves without saying it was a recall, so that the public and the news media would know what was really happening. When J&J was asked about this phantom recall at our first hearing and about the behavior of its contractors, we were basically told that J&J did not know what the contractors were doing. However, documents subsequently obtained by the committee shows that J&J dictated how the phantom recall would be carried out. Internal emails and other documents indicate that J&J clearly knew what it was doing and why. For example, referring to the problems with Motrin that resulted in the phantom recall, one McNeil executive said, "We are just trying to prevent a recall and a lot of expended dollars." In another email, McNeil executive referred to the phantom recall and says, "This was a major win for us as it limits the press that will be seen." Finally, it appears the president of the company gave the go-ahead for the phantom recall, saying, "Let's make this happen as soon as possible." Perhaps we can clear up this apparent discrepancy between J&J testimony in May and the documents that have come to light since that time. J&J has said the FDA knew about and approved the phantom recall, but FDA says that isn't true. Both sides will have an opportunity to tell their side of the story today. But even if the FDA was technically aware of it, that does not excuse what Johnson & Johnson did. Johnson & Johnson had both the legal and moral obligation to do the right thing, and they did not. There are also new questions. Our investigations has uncovered documents that show J&J hired the phantom recall contractors to perform work related to children's Tylenol. In light of what we know now about the phantom recall of adult Motrin, I think J&J has a duty to fully explain how it handled problems with children's medicine. Finally, the troubling issues about rolling recalls and phantom recalls that this hearing examined makes one point very, very clear. Even if the FDA had been notified about the Motrin problem, the agency did not have the legal authority to order a recall. This needs to be rectified. The FDA needs mandatory recall authority, which we've been pushing for. I think most people would be surprised to learn that the FDA, the agency that is responsible for ensuring drug safety, has no power to order a company to recall its defective drugs. This is why I introduced a bill that would give the FDA mandatory recall authority. Hopefully, we can avoid future phantom recalls and empower the FDA to take action to protect the American people. Both Johnson & Johnson and the FDA will be asked questions today, and I hope they are prepared to give us the answers that we need to make certain that the drugs that are on the shelf are safe. On this note, I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, the ranking member, Congressman Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this important second hearing on the failure of FDA regulators of the Johnson & Johnson failure to protect the American people. I think it is critical for us today to understand that Johnson & Johnson and its subsidiaries do not get a pass for failing to meet the high standards expected of their company through their long history. That failure will mar Johnson & Johnson's image for many years to come. No matter how much they correct it, they will live with the repercussions of their failures. But the American people will also, at the end of these hearings, recognize that government has failed to do its job. FDA's explanation appears to include seemingly false statements to this committee in April of this year. Given the documents received by the committee, it demonstrates the FDA was in fact aware that Johnson & Johnson's quiet recall of adult Motrin products, something they led us to believe they were not. Even if we gave them additional authority for mandatory recalls, if they were complicit in a silent recall, then to what end would that new authority be? Mr. Chairman, fundamental concerns of this committee are making government do its job. In the case of the FDA, that means making sure that those who regulate our food and drug supply are careful, thorough, and honest. Regrettably, the pattern emerging at FDA is one of carelessness, deficiencies, and untruthfulness. Now, this is the committee that has now that this committee has sufficient evidence of FDA failure, we must be committed to following up that investigation and its needed reforms. New authority may be part of it, but no amount of authority makes up for failure to do the job you already have authority for and responsibility. Now, Mr. Chairman, there are differences in views today on where this committee should focus its oversight. Well-intentioned men and women on both sides of a partisan aisle often disagree with the best of intentions. When we find agreement on our oversight responsibility, we should pursue them together. That is the case with the FDA and many other issues before this committee. In 2007, White House Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel, then Congressman from Chicago and head of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, described the important role of that this committee plays to ensure responsibility, accountability of government. He said, "We, the Democratic Party, want to be the party that is ferreting out waste and fraud, and the Oversight Committee is the point of the spear for us." Similarly, this committee's former chairman, my colleague from California, Mr. Waxman, noted that Congress does not always fulfill its duty to the American people to provide oversight of the administration. He said, "Congress has failed to meet this constitutional oversight responsibility. On issue after issue, the Congress has failed to conduct meaningful investigations of significant wrongdoing." I happen to agree with Mr. Waxman and Mr. Rahm Emanuel. These are constitutional obligations, and we must vigorously meet those responsibilities. Fortunately, the Chairman and I are pursuing a common investigation It leads us to two sides and two failures. The public has a right to know how Johnson & Johnson got to this point, how they're going to get their reputation back by earning it with high-quality products that meet or exceed all standards. That's important, and it should be bipartisan. Mr. Chairman, today we also have to remember that our first part of our name, Government Oversight and Reform Committee, implies exactly what it means. We are overseeing government. Yes, we're also seeing when government fails in its interaction with business. We must, though, remember that our authority is to oversee and then reform. I, for one, in 2005, had the opportunity to oversee the Mineral Management Service and show that they were a dysfunctional organization, too cozy with those that they oversaw. Unfortunately, in the years that followed, we didn't have reform. And in 2010, the American people paid a high price for that failure to reform. When it comes to the FDA, we have seen the same thing, at least in this circumstance. We cannot fail to do that reform. We cannot wait for the American people to pay with their lives. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his statement, and I want you to know that we're going to live up to our name, oversight and government reform. I want you to know that. Now, you call on the gentleman from Maryland for 3 minutes, Congressman Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I thank you for convening this very important follow-up hearing to consider the safety of medications for children and families. And I'm extremely troubled by what appears to be an egregious pattern of behavior on the part of Johnson & Johnson and their subsidiary McNeil Consumer Healthcare. And as I listen to Mr. Issa, I must say that I think we need to reserve judgment because the FDA, the principal deputy commissioner Sharfstein, will be testifying, and I know him to be a very he was head of Baltimore's health department, and I can think of no one with more integrity and more has put more effort into protecting the safety of our fellow citizens. Now, the Johnson & Johnson website states that, quote, the values that guide our decision-making are spelled out in our credo. Put simply, our credo challenges us to put the needs and well-being of the people we serve first. Living these values, McNeil Consumer Healthcare and Johnson & Johnson were lauded for their efforts recalling Tylenol and temporarily stopping advertising when lives were on the line due to cyanide contamination in 1982. The recent events could not be more different. One day after our last hearing, Blacksmith Brands recalled Pediacare because the products were manufactured by McNeil Healthcare, even though McNeil officials had said that they did not manufacture products for other companies. Yet, it doesn't stop there. In June and July 2010, McNeil Healthcare twice expanded their original January 15, 2010 recall because of TBA contamination, a pesticide and flame retardant. Why exactly were these items not identified 6 months prior in the original recall? Perhaps most disturbing, McNeil's Consumer Healthcare and Johnson & Johnson conspired to put profits first. There is no other conclusion that simply can be drawn. McNeil hired contractors to simply act like regular customers when conducting a soft market withdrawal of tainted Motrin from over 4,000 convenience stores in more than 40 states. Any product that needs to be recalled through a phantom or a regular recall should not be in the hands of consumers and is probably unsafe. Revealing the true motivation for these events, McNeil President Peter Luther wrote on May 27, 2009, given our current financial situation, I hope we're not going to really double our costs to do this. Let's make this happen as soon as possible. Minutes later, J&J Vice President for Sales, Gary Benedict, responded via email that he wanted more information on the situation that day. These actions clearly show that McNeil and Johnson & Johnson knew the product was not safe and that they chose to make profits their first consideration over the safety of their constituents. And with that, I look forward to the testimony, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. I thank the gentleman from Maryland for his statement. I now yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Utah, Congressman Chafee.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for calling this hearing. Thank you all for being here today. Obviously, the American people rely upon the FDA to make sure that our country and our people and our children are safe and secure. We also rely upon big brand names, people like McNeil and Johnson & Johnson, to provide good quality products that families and mothers can use with their children. Yet, despite the hearing earlier this year, there's some very concerning issues that have come to light. I'm very disappointed that the FDA has evidently not given us access to the people on the ground, in Puerto Rico in particular, that have firsthand knowledge of what's happening. I simply do not understand why the San Juan District Director is not made available, as she would provide the best, most comprehensive type of information given the direct nature in which she's been involved. And I think we need to further explore that, Mr. Chairman. And then within the Johnson & Johnson, I want to read some quotes from emails. And if you spend time in your testimony giving us platitudes and, reading things that some corporate communications person wrote, I think you're going to see a frustrated group of members. When we read quote, and these are quotes from within Johnson & Johnson to other Johnson & Johnson employees, quote, FDA is really bending the rules in this case, the Motrin Caplet case, because of the fact that we stopped distribution a while ago, end quote. In another email, quote, regarding FDA documents, all my conversation with the FDA director, Ms. Torres, here in Puerto Rico have been off the record since I cannot quote her. This happens due to my good relationship with her. That's why we are doing something very different. Quote, from another email, the district director is already sticking her neck out as her boss in Washington is more in favor of a recall, end quote. We need some answers from Johnson & Johnson's, and we need some answers from the FDA, because the candor has not been there. It has not been there. This committee has an obligation to the American people to get to the bottom of this. And there's some funny business happening here, and nobody's happy about it. Please, don't just read some testimony that gives us platitudes. Answer these questions. They're serious. And there are millions of Americans that are relying upon the answers to these questions. But based on the evidence that we're starting to see more and more of, it looks like there was much too much of a cozy relationship that does not give the confidence to the American people to buy your products and to insist and make sure that the FDA is actually doing its job. I yield back.
I'd like to thank the gentleman from Utah for his statement. I now yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Congressman Kucinich.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to associate myself with the remarks of Mr. Chaffetz. We don't know if it's in this case, but there are so many areas where regulators and the regulated have a cozy relationship which works to the detriment of the American people. I mean, we need only to look to the BP oil catastrophe to have that underlined boldly. And there sadly are many other examples. We'll find out if that's the case here. But I want to caution some of my colleagues about how we define the work of this committee. Because on one hand, some of my colleagues would reject a beneficial role for government in people's lives. And on the other hand, when a regulatory agency does attempt to assert government responsibility for corporate misconduct, that's not recognized. I mean, this committee is not just oversight of the government. It's oversight of misconduct in the private sector. And there's plenty, it's oversight of corporate conduct in the private sector. And there's plenty of misconduct in the corporate sector. Now, why does it happen? Well, it happens for a lot of reasons. Mostly greed. Why doesn't the government always come forward quickly and call corporations on it? There's a lot of reasons why that happens. One of the reasons is because corporations assert enormous influence on this government because of their campaign contributions. That is the clear fact, incontrovertible evidence to that effect. So we have a problem with the system. Within the context of the system, the American people have a problem in being able to trust corporations, and in this case, Johnson & Johnson is going to have to answer a lot of serious questions about why they should continue to merit the public's trust when apparently they concealed from public awareness information that was vital to protecting people's health. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I understand the bill that you're preparing for this Congress. I think we should start also considering another dimension of corporate responsibility, and that is that if we are able to establish that a corporation knowingly avoided their responsibility to inform the public about a material matter that could create serious injury or death, that corporation's corporate charter should be canceled, and that we should instruct the Justice Department to take steps to do just that in cooperation with attorneys general in various states. I mean, really, if you have any conduct that hurts people and people rely on you to do the right thing and you don't do the right thing, you should actually be put out of business. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman from Ohio for his statement. Now we will turn to our first panel. Our first witnesses are Mr. William Weldon and Ms. Colleen Goggins. William Weldon is the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Johnson & Johnson. Ms. Colleen Goggins is Worldwide Chair of the Johnson & Johnson Consumer Group, and she also testified at the committee's first hearing. Welcome, both of you. It is committee policy that all witnesses are sworn in. So if you would stand and raise your right hand while I administer the oath. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth? If so, answer in the affirmative. Let the record reflect that the witnesses answered. If we may be seated. The rule is here that, of course, you have 5 minutes to give a summary. We have your statement for the record. And, of course, there's a light that comes on, and when you have 1 minute left, the yellow light comes on, and then, of course, at the end there's a red light, and the red light, of course, means stop. So, Mr. Weldon, if you would start, and then, of course, after that, you, Ms. Goggins. Yeah, Mr. Weldon.
Chairman Towns, Congressman Issa, and members of the committee. I'm Bill Weldon, the chairman.
On your mic.
I'm Bill Weldon, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Johnson & Johnson. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to describe our efforts to address the serious quality issues at McNeil Consumer Healthcare. As you know, I was unable, because of back surgery, to testify at the committee's hearing in May. I was grateful for the opportunity to meet with both the chairman and Congressman Issa shortly afterwards to discuss our response to the recalls. It is essential that we work closely with Congress, the FDA, and others to restore the public's confidence in McNeil Consumer Healthcare's products. Mr. Chairman, I know that we let the public down. We did not maintain our high-quality standards, and as a result, children do not have access to our important medicines. I accept full accountability for the problems at McNeil, and I will take full accountability for fixing these problems. After we found a substantial quality issue at McNeil, we instituted a broad precautionary recall of all liquid children's products manufactured in Fort Washington. And even though our medical experts and the FDA agreed that the health risk was remote, we believed it was the right thing to do for patients. We also commenced a complete re-examination of McNeil's manufacturing processes. We are working hard to restore the public's trust and confidence in Johnson & Johnson and to strive to ensure that something like this never happens ever again. I have spent my entire professional career at Johnson & Johnson. I was honored to be appointed Chairman and Chief Executive Officer in 2002. I am very proud to lead Johnson & Johnson and our dedicated, hard-working professionals. We are working hard to bring our important pediatric products back to the market responsibly. Indeed, I am pleased to announce that consumers will soon begin to see McNeil liquid pediatric products back on the shelves. During the week of October 4th, we will begin shipping one of McNeil's children's medicine products to our customers. Although available only in limited quantities at first, almost 1 million bottles, these will be available for release next week. and we expect to distribute a total of 4 million bottles in the United States by the end of the year. As Colleen Goggins testified in May, it is important for consumers to know that the April 2010 recall was not undertaken on the basis of reports of adverse medical events. When we first found the issues that led to the April 2010 recall, we stopped shipping the products, shut down the plant, and issued a broad precautionary recall of all liquid medicines. We have kept McNeil's Fort Washington facility shut down, and we are completely revamping the facility to bring both equipment and procedures up to the high standards that we set for ourselves around the world. The facility will not reopen until we are confident that we can make McNeil products to the high-quality standards that the public, Congress, and the FDA rightfully expect of us. Across McNeil, Johnson & Johnson is investing more than $100 million on facilities, equipment, and other improvements. McNeil retained an independent third-party consultant with expertise in manufacturing and quality systems. McNeil also appointed a new Vice President of Quality Assurance, a new Vice President of Operations, a new plant manager at Fort Washington, and a new head of quality for the Fort Washington plant. Since the hearing in May, these efforts have accelerated. As Ms. Goggins promised during the May hearing, we submitted a comprehensive action plan to the FDA in July. We have established new quality officers for each of our 3 business segments. Quality and manufacturing report to a single point with oversight of our operating companies. This person reports directly to me. I have also personally visited many of our manufacturing facilities to reinforce the importance of quality. In your letter inviting me to testify, you raised questions about the recall of 2 lots of 8-caplet Motrin vials. The documents that we provided to the committee show that McNeil informed FDA officials about our plans for an in-store assessment and then a retrieval of any of the 8-caplet Motrin vials that remained available for sale. I do think the McNeil personnel were trying to be transparent with the FDA. McNeil also notified its customers that it would be sending in personnel to remove the products. Nonetheless, based on what I have learned since the May hearing, including the points that this committee brought to light, it is clear to me that in retrospect, McNeil should have handled things differently. And going forward, if similar situations arise, they will be handled differently. Mr. Chairman, I am committed to working cooperatively with the committee and the FDA to get the McNeil products back on the shelves for the people who rely on them. We look forward to earning back the trust of all those who have depended upon Johnson & Johnson to take care of themselves and their families for decades. I would be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weldon, for your statement. Ms. Goggins.
Sorry. Chairman Towns, Congressman Issa, and members of the committee, I'm Colleen Goggins, the worldwide chairman of the Consumer Group of Johnson & Johnson. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today, as I did in May, to discuss our efforts to address the quality and process issues at McNeil Consumer Healthcare. Because my May testimony contains considerable detail concerning McNeil and the recent recalls, I will be brief in my testimony today. Since my prior appearance before this committee, we've continued to work very hard to address the problems at McNeil. As Mr. Weldon stated, McNeil submitted to the FDA a Comprehensive Action Plan, or CAP, in July. The CAP applies to all the manufacturing facilities McNeil operates to supply the U.S. market, not just the Fort Washington facility that remains closed. The CAP is part of our ongoing dialogue with the FDA to improve product quality, improve quality systems, and enhance training. Under the CAP, we've engaged leading experts on manufacturing processes, and we've also dedicated Johnson & Johnson's own experts to our efforts at McNeil. Mr. Chairman, I understand from your letter inviting me to appear today that you have questions concerning my testimony about the Motrin caplets recall in 2009. I regret if my testimony created any confusion, and I hope that I can clear up any confusion today. By way of background, I learned that the committee was interested in the Motrin recall for the first time during the morning session of the May hearing. We quickly gathered what information we could prior to my testimony in the afternoon, and during my testimony, we committed to provide. At the hearing in May, I told the committee that I believed that there had been discussions with the FDA about our plans with a third-party contractor in connection with the Motrin caplets. I believe that the documents we've now obtained and provided to the committee reflect these discussions and McNeil's efforts to be transparent and act in good faith with the agency. As I tried to make clear in my testimony, I had no knowledge at the time of the May hearing of any instructions that may have been given to any contractor. Since the May hearing, the company located and provided the committee a copy of instructions given by McNeil to its contractor on the Motrin matter. In those instructions, McNeil directed the contractor to purchase the product without engaging in discussions with store personnel. Having now seen those documents, I believe McNeil should have handled things in a more straightforward manner with the retail stores. We as a company have learned from this process and appreciate the committee's help in highlighting these concerns. As I said at the outset, we've committed to deal aggressively and effectively with the quality and process issues we have at McNeil. Although we still have work to do, I do believe we're living up to that commitment. I would be happy to answer any questions you or the other committee members might have.
Thank you very much. Let me thank both of you for your statements and, of course, for being here. Let me begin with you, Mr. Weldon. In your prepared statement to the committee, you talk about a March the 23rd, 2009 field alert that was sent to the FDA about the defective Motrin. This is the product that was taken off the shelves during the phantom recall. That field alert says a third party has been contracted to perform an in-store assessment. That does not say anything about contractors going into stores and not communicating about a recall and buying all the effective products. Then on April the 1st, 2009, just about a week after McNeil told the FDA it would perform an assessment, a McNeil executive emailed your contractors with instructions for the phantom recall, and those instructions say, purchase all of the product and do not communicate to store personnel any information about this product. We also have an email dated April the 16th, 2009, where an employee of one of your contractors informs McNeil that the phantom contractors had already completed 250 visits to stores. Mr. Weldon, don't these documents show that the phantom recall had already been performed in over 200 stores before you make any mention to the FDA about the defective Motrins?
Yes, it does, sir. May I offer some thoughts on this?
Be delighted.
I think your comments are absolutely accurate and correct, and I think this is one of the areas where we have benefited by the guidance of the committee. If you look at the document in March, we were notifying the FDA that we were going to go and audit stores. When we went out in April, April 1st, I think it was, to your reference, we audited stores and also purchased product. April 21st, I think we notified the FDA of exactly what we had done and what we were planning on doing and completing this by July 15th, I think it was. Unfortunately, we did not notify the FDA that we would be purchasing this product. That was a mistake we made. We firmly admit that. We also hope that people would understand that if we went into an account and there was a minimal amount of product there and it did not present a safety hazard to anybody, but actually did not dissolve and give pain as quickly as we would like it to have been, as it should have, we would take that product off the market. We made a mistake. We should have notified them that we would be taking these products if it was small amounts off the shelves. So you're absolutely correct that we made a mistake, but we feel we did keep people informed as to the actions we were taking.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I really appreciate, your explanation. Ms. Goggins, when you testified before this committee 4 months ago, you indicated that Johnson & Johnson did not intend to hide anything about the phantom recall and that Johnson & Johnson did not know what the phantom contractors were doing. You also said that the affected Motrin was sparsely distributed. However, we now have documents that show McNeil wrote instructions for the phantom recall, and it is clear that McNeil's executives were fully aware of the phantom recall while it was going on. We also know that the phantom recall was not sparse because it involved at least 40 states. Can you explain this discrepancy?
I'm sorry, sir. It contained at least 46, you said?
40 states.
40 states. I'm sorry. Thank you. Look at this. Okay. When I testified in Mesa, what I was aware of at the time was that, as I said, we verified that the FDA was aware that we were, as of the SN1 office of the FDA, was aware that we had hired contractors and we were going into stores and we were retrieving product. And we've since determined that was since the April 21st filing of the field alert report. At the time, I was not aware of any retrieval actions going on, I don't believe, and I had not seen any instructions to contractors until the excerpted instructions, I think, were exhibited that day during the hearing. To Mr. Weldon's point, I think that we would agree that were we to do this over, we would certainly be more transparent, particularly with the store personnel, but I don't believe there was ever any intent to mislead or deceive the FDA, sir.
When you say they were notified, what process did you use to do that?
To the point that Mr. Weldon made, and I believe in our testimony, the FDA was notified by a field alert report and submitted on April 21st, and then I believe there was ongoing correspondence between that date and the agreed-to date for the termination of that work, which was July 15th.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. My time has expired. And now you have 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, the ranking member, Congressman Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to continue along that line because our documents appear to be, again, a little different than what I'm hearing. I have a McNeil document dated March 23rd, 2009 to Ms. Torres, but very clearly it says attached, please find the third follow-up to the field alert report for Motrin caplets submitted November 26, 2008. So now, really, the FDA was well informed November 26, 2008. Is that correct?
Yes, the first field alert report was filed in November of 2008.
So let's put it in perspective. As Mr. Weldon had said, there was a stealth recall, phantom recall, remaining product purchased back because it was less than effective as prescribed. And I understand that that's just as good a reason to get something off the market as anything else, but it was not something that you took it and you were poisoned, you took it and you were hurt, but you took it and your headache didn't go away, right? That's pretty much. Okay. So this product that the FDA is aware doesn't work, dissolve, do its job properly. The FDA is aware of it November 26. So you've got pieces of November, all of December, all of January, all of February, almost all of March, and then in April, March, April, the product is actually removed. So in retrospect, one, it should have been removed quicker once you knew it didn't work. Two, Mr. Weldon, you've already said, and so have you, Ms. Goggins, that if you had to do over again, you'd do it in a more general recall way. But I'm trying to understand why the FDA was so slow in going through to make a decision, and why in earlier testimony they sort of say, well, we didn't find out, we didn't know, when in fact they knew for month after month, and emails show that there was dialogue. I'm going to ask you two a tough question, because although I'm very disappointed in Johnson & Johnson, I said it in the first hearing, I say it again, this is not what we expected from a company with your history. But it happened. You didn't do your job well in a number of quality areas. But let me ask you, is your relationship ordinarily supposed to be so cozy as to have months of discussion and informal back channel and then be allowed to have if you will, an undocumented recall. Is that what should be happening? Is that what we should expect from the FDA or tolerate? Both of you, please.
Congressman Issa, I think that my response to that would be that I asked the same question about our organization. Is there a way we could do this faster? It seemed like exactly the same question you're asking. It seemed like it took a protracted period of time. And I think in the future we try and accelerate that to see if we could do it faster to get the product off the market. As far as relationships and things like that, I think it is important that there is dialogue between the FDA in this case and our company to ensure that we're doing the right thing. So I can't comment exactly on the discussions that went on or the relationship, but I think it is very important and very normal that there would be a dialogue before action is taken.
Okay, well, I'm going to follow up with another question because you can never take a CEO out once he's been one. When I looked at your reorganization, your July plan, I begged two questions. First of all, you have single-line accountability from quality to you. Should have been that way to begin with. But in our research, there was a period of time at McNeil where they were clearly trying to cost down QC. Today, who controls the decision of how much money the QC portion of any of your companies can spend? In other words, who's responsible for making sure they're fully funded and not part of an edict to lower cost?
Congressman, respectfully, I'd like to maybe clarify one point. We've gone back and looked at the period between 2006 and 2009, and at best, the costs, again, on quality at McNeil were flat. Actually, they increased during that period of time. And the headcount was constant also. There was not a reduction.
No, that came out in the first hearing. What I'm looking at is in your plan going forward, because our responsibility is to fix the FDA going forward, but it's also to have confidence in companies like yours. Who determines if there's sufficient funds today? Does a plant manager, a division CEO, chief operating officer, chief financial officer, if the quality control people believe they do not have the resources, whether it's a new tool, advanced technology in the production line, or actual personnel, how is that done today so that we can know that those cost efficiencies are not being looked at by somebody far away and too many chains between them?
Yes, sir. That would be determined by the quality people, directly to the individual who reports to me and myself. So, and we have let it be known that we will not get in the way of costs. We want to make sure we are investing appropriately in quality, and that decision, it will be made directly up to and including myself.
Okay, and then if you can quickly, Fort Washington, when it reopens, tell me how it's going to be different in a way the American people can believe in product that eventually comes from there.
Sir, I would like to say we are working closely with the FDA, external consultants, and our own people to invest, as I mentioned, $100 million across the McNeil facilities. We're going to make that the state-of-the-art facility. It will not be opened up until we are sure it is state-of-the-art. I'd like to say it will be the best in the world. That's what we would like it to be, but I will guarantee it will be state-of-the-art and people can have the highest degree of confidence. We will not ship a product out of there until we have been able to satisfy the expectations of the people who will use our products.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Recognize the gentleman from Maryland for 5 minutes.
Mr. Weldon, on August 19th, an online article in Fortune magazine suggested that McNeil had exceptional quality control measures until 2002, the year you assumed the position of chairman and chief executive officer. The article suggests that the cost-cutting had a significant impact on the quality control staff and procedures across the company. Are you familiar with that article?
Yes, sir.
All right. Further, the article is critical of your ability to manage the consumer products business we're discussing today. Is it possible that cost-cutting contributed to the culture that created the quality issues?
Sir, I do not believe that cost-cutting contributed to this.
Well, do you think that cost-cutting, do you think the cost-cutting culture may have inadvertently created a situation in which phantom recalls and processes that did not put consumer safety first could occur?
No, sir. Could I elaborate on that? Because
I only have 5 minutes. I do want you to answer, though, briefly.
Okay. I said no, sir. I do not believe. I do not believe that cost-cutting nor financials were put ahead of the quality for patients at any of our facilities.
So, Weldon, in your testimony, you stated that McNeil believed that the phantom recall was an expeditious way to remove the remaining caplets from the convenience store shelves. If the product was not good enough or safe enough to sell, why would it be good enough for consumers to keep it in their homes, in their medicine cabinets?
Sir, first of all, I think we had looked at this closely and determined there was no risk, no safety hazard, no risk to patients who consume these products. We thought it was a way to expeditiously get the product out of the market, and I think it was in May that we sent a letter to the customers notifying them of this action and telling them that we wanted to remove the products that were in the facilities.
Why do you think they conducted this phantom recall?
Sir, that I can't address. I would not quite characterize it that way, but I do believe that we kept people informed. I think that we just talked about the document in March, saying that we were going to approach this in a way of taking an audit. We made a mistake in that we did not say we would be acquiring or retrieving the product during that period of time, but shortly thereafter, we notified the FDA of our actions, our intent, and that we would have this product off the market in July, and we executed against that plan.
I noticed that Mr. Issa spent some time, I guess, sort of halfway complimenting you on making changes. I think Ms. Goggins talked about changes that you all have made, and you made some significant changes, have you not?
Yes, sir, and I think it is the guidance of the committee that's helped us see some of the changes and some of the issues that we really did need to make at the Fort Washington facility, and we've taken it beyond that to help ensure that we have actually learned and grown and continue to learn across Johnson & Johnson.
Well, let me ask you this question about how much you've learned and grown. Mr. Weldon, both you and Ms. Goggins have stated that you have addressed the issues with McNeil Consumer Healthcare by changing the senior leadership. Yet, Mr. Peter Luther, you know him?
Yes, sir.
The current president of McNeil remains in place. It seems disingenuous to suggest that you change leadership to fix the problem when key people involved in the decisions to conduct the phantom recall, and I know you don't call it a phantom recall, I call it a phantom recall, remain in place. Can you comment on whether Mr. Luther is competent to do what is needed to fix the problem when he was involved in the problem originally?
Yes, sir, and I do appreciate the way you refer to the recall. I appreciate that. Mr. Luther has been a long-serving Johnson & Johnson employee. He has been a good employee for a very extended period of time. Mr. Luther also is very committed to improving and revamping the facility, and he's very committed to doing that. And we're looking forward to the results of what he is doing. So yes, I think Peter Luther is a good employee who will contribute to rectifying this problem.
And so the same folk that were around when the problem took place, you then put it in their hands to fix the problem. Is that it? And I think you said in a very, very sincere way that you were looking to get the public's trust. And we all know in order to get the public's trust, you need people in place that the people trust, the consumers trust. And to me, that doesn't make very much sense. And then put the person who was in charge when the problem came up back in charge. You follow me?
Yeah, I do, sir. And I think we all, as I said, share accountability in this. I think that Mr. Luther was in charge, but I think that you can see that there were many changes that were taken that were in the quality area, the manufacturing area, to ensure that we have the best representation there. As I said, Mr. Luther has been a long-serving employee who's done a very good job for us, but he is also committed to and has been very instrumental in making sure that we are revamping and improving the facility. So I think there's accountability that is shared across the organization, and I think that the players that we needed to replace have been replaced.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. And now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Utah, Congressman Chafee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Goggins, with the Motrin phantom or silent recall retrieval, was it McNeil's understanding that until July 2009, the FDA was not requesting a recall? Is that correct?
Yes, that's our understanding, sir.
And had the FDA wanted or even suggested a recall at the time a problem was discovered, would you have issued a recall?
In fact, I believe that the FDA told us in that time period that they wanted to classify our retrieval as a recall, and we filed the forms almost immediately.
Do you, what percentage of the product shipped was actually recalled? Do you have any idea?
I'm estimating it's about 1% of the product shipped was recalled, sir.
Mr. Weldon, you said in your testimony that you wanted the right thing to do was an imperative for you. I'm having a hard time with maybe the directive from the CEO's office and the way you feel personally with what happened on the ground. Were any of the personnel fired, relieved of their duties, dismissed, demoted? What's happened to all these players that were involved here from your operation?
I can't comment. I know some people have been relieved of their responsibilities, and there's some new people in the facilities, yes, but I don't know all the direct...
Ms. Goggins, do you have...
Yes, to elaborate on Mr. Weldon's point, we have a new, at McNeil, we have a new head of manufacturing, we have a new head of quality. In the two largest plants that we have, our Las Piedras plant and our Fort Washington plant, we have new people both in manufacturing.
Was anybody fired?
Yes. Yes, that's my point.
Mr. Weldon, I believe you when you personally say you want to do the right thing, but I have a hard time rectifying what was actually happening on the ground within your organization. You said you want to take personal responsibility for it. Let me read this excerpt from March 24th, 2009 emails from Paul DiPaolo, and pardon if I'm mispronouncing these names, to Daniel, I can't pronounce his last name, Figus, I guess is his name. Quote, the FDA is really bending the rules in this case, the Motrin Caplet case, because of the fact that we stopped distribution a while ago. Doesn't that imply that there was some encouragement from Johnson & Johnson to bend the rules?
You know, I can't directly know what was meant by that. It says that the email says exactly what it says. I think that what we're looking at here is the ability to dialogue and make the right decisions.
And you say that, but then when you say the FDA is really bending the rules, and that's coming from a Johnson & Johnson employee to another Johnson & Johnson employee, it doesn't look as if you're doing, quote, the right thing to do. Let me read another email. Quote, regarding FDA documents, this is from Eddie Carrillo to Carolyn Perzali. Again, I'm slaughtering their names. Quote, regarding FDA documents, all my conversation with the FDA director, Ms. Torres, here in Puerto Rico, have been off the record since I cannot quote her. This happens due to my good relationship with her, and that's why we are doing something very different. Is that inappropriate mode of conduct? I mean, does this regularly happen above and beyond this one instance where you're having off-the-record discussions, that the relationship is so cozy? Is this common practice? Is this something you condone? Is this an exception to what?
No, we don't condone it, sir. I can't comment for the conversations that go on across the organization. What I can comment on is that we would like to have, and I think we have worked cooperatively, and I think with the FDA to ensure that we have a dialogue to make sure that the right things are done for the patients and to make sure we're behaving in a proper way. As far as being able to comment as to whether on specific emails, no, sir, I can't comment on those.
Help me understand, for the record, moving forward, Johnson & Johnson's commitment on what is the proper way.
Johnson & Johnson's commitment on what is the proper way to continue to dialogue with the FDA and to ensure that we're looking out for the rights for the best interest of patients. Sir, if I could elaborate for a little bit, I think that we try and establish ourselves. I think there's a reference that the chairman made earlier on to our credo, and our credo, our first responsibility is to the people that use our products. I stated, and I would state again, that we let them down. There's absolutely no doubt we let them down. This was not one of our best moments. We are going to improve it, and we're going to fix it and improve upon it. And we are stressing, as I said also, I've gone out to our facilities, I've talked to our people, and I've talked to our leadership to ensure that we continue to reinforce the responsibility we have to the people who use our products. There is absolutely nothing more important than ensuring the safety of our products and the quality of our products. So going forward, we are committed to doing the right thing for patients.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time has expired. I'll yield back.
Thank you. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Congressman Kucinich.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The committee has documents that demonstrate that on September 18, 2009, there was a letter to healthcare professionals, like physicians, explaining the recall of children's and infants' Tylenol. On the third line of the second paragraph of this particular document, B. Sapatia is clearly mentioned. It mentions that children with underlying pulmonary disease, cystic fibrosis, or compromised immune systems are at high risk. Then there was another document dated September 24, 2009, just 6 days later. Describes the recall of children's and infants' Tylenols from Tylenol.com. It's directed at the public, but there was no mention of B. Sapatia, no mention of any conditions a child might have, like cystic fibrosis, that would make them more vulnerable. Now, this would make sense if a patient had to go to their doctor to get the medicine, but because the doctor would have a chance to convey the hazard to the patient, this was an over-the-counter drug. Now, and apparently they kept the public out of the loop. So, follow this pattern. We've got McNeil knowing a product was defective. They kept it away from public knowledge. They hired phantom contractors who purchased the product but did not inform store personnel. As a matter of fact, their contractors were told, don't tell the store personnel. Inform the doctors, don't inform the public. Mr. Chairman, what we have here, I think, is a pattern of concealment. Now, one of the things I'm concerned about, with all due respect to Mr. Weldon, your testimony and presentation has all the earmarks of coaching from these spin doctors who help corporate executives put a good face on misconduct. To say, okay, admit, throw yourself in a mercy on the court, we did wrong. But wait a minute, there's a pattern of concealment here. You can't call that pattern a mistake. A person can make a mistake once, but if you keep making the quote mistake, unquote, over and over and over, then somebody has to ask, well, it's just the way you do business, or the way you did business. Now, Ms. Goggins, I was present at your testimony the last time, and there's a transcript of your testimony. And I listened carefully when you said at the time of the hearing that you weren't aware of any retrieval actions. Now, I have here a memo which the chairman alluded to in his opening statement, which is from is to Gary Benedict from Bob Miller. And listen to this memo. Gary, as you know, we've negotiated an agreement with the FDA not to formally conduct a recall for Motrin's 8s, but rather conduct a, quote, soft market withdrawal, unquote. This was a major win for us as it limits the press that will be seen. We had committed to FDA to complete this withdrawal by July 15th. There have been continuing issues trying to get a PO, purchase order, from the marketing group, which is now putting our ability to meet the July 15th timeframe in jeopardy. At the same time as we delay this work, the cost to complete the work continues to increase because of the fact that the outside resource, that is the people involved in this recall, in the phantom recallers, will now need more resources to expedite the work. We cannot extend our commitment date to FDA. It is now estimated this will cost approximately $400,000, which is approximately 2 times what was originally quoted. And then Peter Luthers has an answer here. Group, where's the miss here? Given our current financial situation, I hope we're not going to really double our costs to do this. Let's make this happen ASAP. Now, Ms. Goggins, since you're the head of this consumer group, are you trying to lead this committee to believe that you knew nothing about it? That apparently from this memo, there was widespread discussion within your organization about a phantom recall, about the cost of the recall, about not being able to get cooperation from the marketing people. You're at the top of this group, and you knew nothing about it? Really? Do you want to? I'm not talking about what's on the record here. Are you saying that no one ever talked to you about it? not only you have no recollection, no one talked to you. You're sure that no one talked to you about it. Please help us.
Yes, I will. Thank you for the opportunity. As I said in my opening testimony,
No, answer my question, not your opening testimony. What's the answer to my question?
I did not know at the time that I testified in May. I have since learned from looking at documents that there was a retrieval going on. I did not know that at the time of my testimony in May, I don't believe.
Mr. Chairman, I have to tell you, this testimony is lacking in credibility in light of this particular document. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I now recognize the lady from Washington, D.C., Congresswoman Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question about children's medicine. We have a McNeil document that shows that a contaminant was discovered in April 2008. And another document that shows that more than 8 million bottles had been shipped starting in March 2008. So when you put these two documents together, doesn't this mean that although your company recalled 8 million bottles of the children's medicine in 2009, that the fact is that you had discovered the problem at least a year earlier in 2008?
May I comment on that?
Yes, Mr. Weldon, this is a question for you.
Thank you. I'd like to maybe clarify the record as in terms of what exactly took place. And we're talking about the Bisapacia and the potential bacterial contamination of the product. Just to maybe shed a little light on it, the way we manufacture our product is we order product from, we order, let's say, raw materials or from suppliers. We then test those raw materials, we manufacture product, we test the product, and then we release the product. What happened in this case is we had done that, and in a batch of raw materials that came from a supplier, we detected Bisapacia. We eliminated that from our manufacturing. We want to be clear that none of that was used in any product that was manufactured or left our facility. We went back and checked Bisapacia. We went back and checked the product. We wanted to make sure there was no risk, as we saw, to anybody that was there, anybody that would consume this product. The following year, I think you said in 2009, the FDA came to inspect our facility, and they found exactly what we had done. And they said there could be a risk that there is Bisapacia in the product that was delivered, that was gone out. We had never used, I want to be clear, we had never used the raw materials that had Bisapacia. We felt confident in the work we had done that there was no Bisapacia in the products that we released.
But so you believe that in 2008 that those 8+ million bottles that had been shipped starting in 2009, which your own document says get consumed very quickly.
That's correct.
That you believe that none of this contaminant made its way into those 8 million bottles.
That's correct, because the raw material that had Bisapacia we did not use to manufacture any product. We eliminated that. The FDA's position, and in discussion we said fine, was that possibly there could have been in some products. So we recalled the product. But we were confident in the manufacturing process, the checks that we used, and then we have a thing called retained samples where we take these and put them aside of the products that are manufactured. We went and checked that after we brought product back. We went and checked those retained samples, and there was no trace of Bisapacia. But to protect patients and as a precautionary measure, and I think we also mentioned this in the communications that went out to the customers that we had, we said that there was a product there that we did not know had any problems. We had worked closely with the FDA on this to take the product off the market, and we have today we still have no we do not feel, and we have no indication that any product that was ever shipped had B. cepacia. But because of the product we did not use, the raw material, there was a concern there could have been a potential risk. So we accepted that and withdrew the product. But we have never confirmed that there was any B. cepacia in any of the products we released, and it was never used. I'm stressing, the raw material that had B. cepacia in it was never used to manufacture a product that was shipped out of the facility.
In any of those 8 million?
In any of those 8 million,
Okay.
yes, ma'am.
Mr. Weldon, let me ask you another question. Is it not true that 8-count vials of Motrin tablets can no longer be found on your store shelves because you no longer make them?
That's correct. To the best of my knowledge, that's correct.
But isn't it commonly known that Motrin tablets were removed from store shelves because the product was defective?
Yes, ma'am. Once again, to clarify, we identified there was never a health risk to patients. What we found is that this product dissolved more slowly than we would have liked it to have dissolved, and it was supposed to have dissolved. So we went out and took the products off the shelf. That's correct.
Well, I wonder if you could explain this guidance given to Johnson & we have another document here, given to Johnson & Johnson and to McNeil employees in an internal email to tell customers that the product is not on the shelves because your company no longer makes it. Here's the email. Isn't a recall, and the consumer will not know that we recalled it. Our candid response to the customers is that we no longer make the 8-count vial.
Yes, I'm not familiar with that specific document. I'm not sure if it refers to. It was referring to notifying our own internal employees that we no longer made it.
It tells your employees what to tell the customers.
And that is correct. We no longer, again, I don't see the document, I don't know, but we no longer make that product. That's absolutely correct.
You do have the document before you, though. I understand.
I do.
The document says, unfortunately, the consumer Q&A form doesn't apply to the Motrin products since it isn't a recall and the consumer will not know that we recalled it. It's only 2 lots of the product, you say. They simply won't be able to find it on the shelf. They will not know we recalled it. They simply will not know they are not able to find it on the shelf. Our candid response to the consumers is that we no longer make the 8-count vial.
Could I take a moment and just read this to?
Please.
On that note, I'll give the gentlewoman additional time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thought he had the document and looked at it.
I did. I just wasn't aware of it. I apologize. Yeah, it says it refers to a consumer Q&A that I'm not aware of, but it does say that the response to the consumer is that we no longer make the 8-count vial.
Oh, is that the
that is correct? We no longer make it now.
Is that the response under all the circumstances that should have been made? No recall. We just don't make it.
No, ma'am. I think that there are some lessons that we've learned, and I think that you all have helped us with this. I think some of the wording that we've used and the directions we've given have been inappropriate. I cannot comment on this specifically, but I can assure you that we would be much more transparent with our customers and the people that would have our products in the future. And I think
you understand that there's a difference between telling a consumer you no longer make a product, which may simply mean you decided to move on to another product, and telling the consumer that the product has been recalled, so that the consumer may know to look himself or herself for the product and all that goes along with recalled products.
Yes, ma'am, and I do appreciate your comments. I do think in May we did send out an announcement saying that we were going to be taking these products off the shelves, but I think your point is well taken. Thank you.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. And now you'll 5 minutes to the gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ms. Goggins and Mr. Weldon for being here. There were repeated instances of alarming problems with Johnson & Johnson's children's medicine from 2008 to 2010. And in April 2008, McNeil began receiving reports that an uncharacteristic odor in its products was causing nausea, stomach pain, vomiting, and diarrhea. FDA found that McNeil's initial investigation into these complaints was unjustifiably delayed and terminated prematurely. Over 100 additional complaints later, McNeil did not discover the root cause of the contamination until September 2009. Why did it take so long to figure out the cause of the contamination?
Yes, sir. This was an area where we have learned a very important lesson. And as you said, in 2008, there were adverse events reported that we knew, and it had to deal with the aroma in the product, and then some reported cases of nausea and vomiting. We investigated that to see if there was a microbial content or any content in the product. We found that there was not, and we saw that the adverse events fell off. So we knew that there was, at that point, we identified that there would be no harm to patients. There was some gastric distress, but no serious adverse events. The adverse events fell off. They came back in September, I guess in 2009. I'm not sure exactly the date. We then investigated it, and I think worked closely with the FDA to identify. And I have to say it was a very complex issue to identify a product called TBA. And what had happened is this is a preservative. There's a preservative put on wooden pallets that can migrate into packaging material. It was something that was been very hard to identify and determine. Now, I also want to be clear. We should have determined the root cause in 2008. I do not want to defend our inaction there, and I think the FDA pointed that out correctly to us, and we appreciate that. What we did do, though, in working closely with the FDA, was able to identify this, and it was a very, very difficult initiative that needed to be undertaken, and we were able to determine it. And I think, as the FDA has said, this actually helped to lead to some new guidance documents from the FDA for everybody to benefit by. So I do not want to make any excuses for what we should have done in 2008, which was to have determined the root cause. As a corporation, we know today if we have adverse events we need to investigate, we investigate them thoroughly until we determine the root cause. And that's exactly what happened in this instance. We did not, and the FDA was absolutely correct in pointing that out to us, and we did identify it ultimately. It was it was a very scientifically challenging exercise, but that's no excuse. We did ultimately determine it, and I think in combination with the FDA, I think it's something that will benefit many people.
But Mr. Weldon, it leached through the
Yes, that's correct. What happens is they put a preservative on a wooden pallet, which materials are shipped on, and the preservative can actually break down and actually, as the words you described are very accurate, leach into the packaging material. And that packaging material then, when you put the product in it and you ship the product out, can actually cause this musty odor, this smell. And I think it was something, again, I want to say that I think it was a combination of people working closely together to determine this. And I think ultimately a guidance document has gone out that will help many people in this area.
Thank you for that response, Mr. Weldon. Regulations require drug makers to submit field reports within 3 working days of receipt of information concerning any bacteriological contamination or any significant physical or other change or deterioration in its drug products. Yet, when McNeil began receiving consumer complaints in 2008, McNeil did not alert FDA. Further, when McNeil had test results confirming the contamination, These results were not shared with FDA. Why didn't McNeil share this info with FDA as required?
I cannot comment on that. I just can't comment. I'm not aware of that specific.
Can Ms. Goggins, can you explain it?
Sorry. I don't know which incident you're referring to. Are you referring to the Bisapatia issue, sir, or what are you referring to?
Well, okay, here, your FDA regulations
Right,
require.
right, absolutely.
Okay, well, let's go back to the first instance. Did you report it within 3 days?
Well, to Mr.
You can twist my words if you like, but you still can't get around the fact that you didn't follow the rules that you are required to. You can twist my words if you want, but why didn't you report it?
I'm sorry.
Within 3 days.
I wasn't trying to twist your words, sir. I apologize.
Okay, well, do you understand the question now?
I do understand the question.
Okay.
And to Mr. Weldon's point, we are aware of the regulations for the FDA, and you're absolutely right. We're supposed to report these within 3 days to the FDA.
And you didn't.
I don't know which incident you're talking about. If we did not, sir, we should.
Or any of the incidents. You didn't report it in a timely fashion within 3 days.
Sir, if
So why didn't you? Question.
Yes, that I cannot answer. I would say, though, in all instances, in some instances, I know that we did. I don't know the specific instance. If we did not, it was a mistake on our part, and we should have. You're absolutely correct.
My time has expired. Yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Before we let you go, there's some terms, actually phrases that have been used. I want to make certain that the committee understands. You use the term soft market withdrawal. What does that really mean? Soft market withdrawal.
Mr. Chairman, I have no idea what soft market withdrawal is. I've heard the term.
It's used in the memos and the emails that we receive.
I'm not familiar with the term. I do not know what it means.
Ms. Goggins, do you know what it means?
No, we don't use that term regularly, so I've not heard before this instance.
You know, why would the employees use it? Maybe it's the same thing as phantom recall. I'm trying to figure this out because, you know, you've seen it, you've heard it, you know, and what do you think it means? I mean, we don't know.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the language is very unfortunate. It's terminology we don't use, and I also don't think it reflects accurately our priorities and the fact that we try to put safety of patients first. And I think that the use of language is unfortunate.
Well, you want to comment, Mr. Weldon?
Well, I think, Mr. Chairman, the comment that I would make is that I think we've learned a lot of lessons through this unfortunate situation. I have said to you and to Mr. Issa and to the committee that we have learned and benefited by being here. I think that we have discussed and can show you the changes we have made, the commitments we're making, the resources we are investing, the people we're putting into roles. I can only assure you that we will do everything in our power to never let this happen again. I think that the characterization of phantom, soft, all kinds of things, I cannot explain to you. I wish I could, and I think many people use many different terms. What I can assure you is that we are committed to ensuring to resolve these problems, to fix these problems, and to make sure that we are giving the highest quality products to patients. As I said earlier, I think that, and I will tell you very honestly that the FDA and Johnson & Johnson, the people at McNeil have worked so closely together that we will be able to deliver some of these products in the market next week, and that is much faster than we ever thought we could have done. Our own internal expectation was that it would have been much later. Now, we're not able to fulfill the whole market, but I think because of the efforts that we have made collectively, we're going to be able to get these products back into the market for people that need them, and that is our single greatest concern. I can only commit to you we will do the best we possibly can, and we will do everything we can to ensure this never happens again.
Mr. Weldon, let me thank you for coming
Mr. Chairman.
To testify, and of course, gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Chairman, with the unanimous consent of the committee, you know, I have a follow-up question to Ms. Goggins to try to square this testimony that she just gave based on committee documents that I've just received.
Well, let me just say that before I recognize the ranking member, let me just say that I will give you 2 minutes to raise the issue and the question.
I appreciate the indulgence of my colleagues.
Gentlemen,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as we go to the second panel, I would only ask, because of the gravity of this hearing, of the failures at J&J and the corrective action that we're expecting you to do, plus the likelihood that we're going to have follow-up questions for you in writing, if you would both do the fairly extraordinary thing of remaining here through the FDA testimony as principals. We do believe that what you're doing is essential. We're obviously interested enough, even after the House is adjourned, to hold this hearing because this is important. The American people know we're getting it right. So I would only ask that you do the follow-up written questions and of course, yield back so the other gentleman can ask his.
thank you, gentlemen, and I also agree with the fact that really appreciate if you would stay and hear the testimony of FDA. Gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Committee produced a document here to Colin Goggins from, among others, Peter Luther and Bob Miller relating to the final remediation plan for the children's Tylenol. Now, on the document that I raised a question on, my last question, I pointed out that Bob Miller and Peter Luther were involved in a communication involving Motrin, and for some reason, Ms. Goggins, who was in the loop on the children's Tylenol, would leave this committee to believe that on something that apparently had wide circulation within her organization, she didn't know anything about it. Now, Mr. Chairman, one of two things happened here. Either she was out of the loop on that, and if she was, a pattern of concealment from her needs to be further investigated, or the other part is that, Ms. Goggins, you're not telling the truth. Now, would you like to respond to why you were kept in a loop on this, but you weren't kept in on the children's Tylenol issue, but you were, as you say, were kept out of the loop, or imply that you were kept out of the loop on the Motrin issue? Could you square the discrepancy there on your inter-office communications?
Yes, I will. I was not in the loop, as you put it, on the Motrin recall, but I was in the loop on the children's Tylenol recall.
Why?
That is because we received a 483 with a number of observations regarding the issue of the children's recall in June of that year. So it was brought to my
But why?
attention.
I mean, were you concerned about that, or if you found out?
I was very concerned.
Who kept you out of the loop? And why were they in a loop and you weren't? Because you're the head of the consumer products.
I was not in the loop, as you say, for the Motrin recall until I came to the committee, and then I went back and looked at the documents after my testimony. On the children's Tylenol recall, which happened when we received the FDA 483 in June of 2009, I was made aware of that. I was very displeased with that, and I maybe inserted myself in the loop, if you will.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to ask you to direct staff to call some of the people on this list who are involved in these communications, because we may find out something that might be a benefit to the work of this committee.
Without objection, so ordered. Let me thank you, the two of you. Thank you again, Mr. Weldon, for coming in your testimony. I want to thank you, Ms. Goggins, for coming back. I really want to appreciate, because as you can see, that there is a concern here, and we also want to make certain that, when medication is on the shelf, that it is safe. And we have that obligation and responsibility. So thank you again for it, and we hope that you will remain and hear the testimony of FDA. Thank you for your testimony. We now will move to our second panel. Dr. Joshua Sharfstein is the Principal Deputy Commissioner at the Food and Drug Administration. It is committee policy, Dr. Sharfstein, that we swear all of our witnesses in. So if you would stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth and nothing but the whole truth? If so, answer in the affirmative. Thank you. Let the record reflect that he answered in from. You may be seated. Mr. Sharfstein, you have 5 minutes to deliver your testimony, and of course, which will allow the members an opportunity to raise questions with you. So you may proceed.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, members of the committee, I am Dr. Joshua Sharfstein, the Principal Deputy Commissioner of the FDA. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I would like to provide a brief update on FDA's investigation of the serious quality lapses at McNeil and then address the phantom recall. First, FDA has continued to investigate whether any serious illnesses or deaths have been linked to the recall. Since the last hearing, FDA has looked into adverse events reported to FDA and McNeil, citing the products subject to the recalls. This investigation covers over 2,400 reports received by FDA for the 2-year period preceding the recall, as well as for the 2-month period immediately afterward. We did not, in this process, establish any direct link to a serious adverse event, including death and a recall product. Second, FDA has worked with McNeil to improve the 2 facilities at the center of the previous recalls. In Puerto Rico, as has been mentioned, FDA became aware that McNeil had received reports of products from its Las Piedras facility having a musty, moldy odor, and McNeil did not conduct a thorough, timely investigation of the issue or file timely reports. After FDA personnel urged McNeil to do more, the firm identified the cause of the odor to be a chemical called 2,4,6-tribromoanisole, or TBA, a pesticide used to treat wooden pallets. FDA issued McNeil a warning letter very quickly on January 15, 2010, related to this failure, and FDA since then has issued guidance and letters to industry. Subsequent investigations by customers have led to additional recalls, and McNeil has informed us that the firm has stopped using the wooden pallets, cleaned its facilities, and increased its oversight and qualification standards of its suppliers. FDA is currently conducting a follow-up inspection of the facility. In Pennsylvania, FDA found that the facility in Fort Washington had not conducted adequate investigations of product problems and complaints. During the April 2010 inspection, the firm announced it would stop manufacturing liquid products and conduct a major recall, as you know, because of excessive particulate matter, potency variability, and possible microbial contamination. Subsequently, the firm held a series of meetings with FDA and identified many corrective actions the company would take. These corrective actions include ceasing all manufacturing and renovation of the Fort Washington facility, remediating the quality systems, and using a third-party expert consulting firm to review all aspects of the firm's manufacturing quality changes. We're continuing to review and provide feedback to the company. In addition, since the last hearing, third, all facilities associated with McNeil have been inspected at least once within the last year. FDA has found inspectional deficiencies of varying degrees of seriousness in all of these facilities. One common concern the agency has found is that the failure to investigate and correct product problems in a prompt and thorough manner. McNeil has responded to these observations with a large-scale corrective plan. FDA is currently reviewing and investigating this plan to ensure that corrective actions are actually effective. Fourth, FDA has continued discussions with Johnson & Johnson, the parent company of McNeil, to address the breakdowns in leadership and oversight that led to these serious compliance problems. We recognize the company is taking the agency concerns seriously and many changes have been made. We intend to keep a close eye on these facilities until the company earns our confidence back. In February of 2010, FDA called an extraordinary meeting with the senior executives of Johnson & Johnson. At that meeting, the agency discussed a number of serious compliance problems at McNeil. More broadly, FDA confronted these executives about whether McNeil's corporate culture supported a robust quality system to ensure the purity, potency, and safety of its products. As part of that meeting, the agency raised concerns about what's been called the phantom recall of subpotent Motrin tablets in the spring of 2009. FDA raised this concern because it seems strange and concerning that the company had paid a contractor to go into retail stores across the country to purchase all available product while acting like a regular customer and not disclosing what was going on. In the summer of 2009, the agency told the company to register a real recall. Over the last several months, the committee has investigated this event further, using its authority to gather additional information from the company and the agency. Because of this committee's investigation, we understand much more about these events. My understanding comes from documents that have been provided to the committee by McNeil and FDA. Materials gathered in the related criminal investigation. Based on what we know now, the phantom recall raises important questions for Johnson & Johnson, FDA, and Congress. The current voluntary system of drug recalls depends on companies providing accurate and complete information to the agency and recalling adulterated or otherwise violated products in a prompt and appropriate manner. As you and other members of the committee have stated, the new documents raise serious questions about whether the company's actions have met this standard. But regardless of the behavior of a company, it is FDA's job to do everything possible to protect the public. It was clear in November 2008 that the Motrin lots did not meet specifications, yet the actual recall did not happen until early August of the following year, and the notification in the FDA's recall bulletin did not happen until November of the following year. This took too long. Part of this delay can be attributed to several months spent checking whether or not any remaining product was on the shelves. And as a result, in part to less than forthright communication about how much would be on the shelves. The company was telling FDA there was nothing on the shelves. Their internal documents indicate they knew that there was product on the shelves. Then, in April 2009, the company sent a report to FDA indicating it was purchasing product from the shelves of retailers. This communication did not fully disclose the likely scale of the action or the way that the company was intending to proceed. In other words, it did not disclose the phantom part of the phantom recall. From this point, it took until July for FDA to tell the company that a recall should be conducted. In July, FDA not only instructed the company that it should be registered as a recall, but then went on to confront the senior executives at Johnson & Johnson about what happened. In my opinion, however, the message that was delivered should have been delivered sooner by FDA. FDA has no legal authority to require a manufacturer to recall a drug product that is unsafe or is not in compliance with current good manufacturing practice. The recall system depends on full and open disclosure, trust, and the industry's acceptance of its responsibilities. FDA urges and expects firms to notify the agency when it's initiating a recall, but firms have no legal requirement to provide this type of notification. If a firm does initiate a drug recall, the agency does not have the authority to approve the manner in which the firm conducts the recall or to direct the firm to adopt a different recall strategy. Although the agency is able to accomplish most drug recalls with the cooperation of the manufacturer, there are instances in which firms are reluctant or unwilling to conduct a recall or to do so in a time frame that FDA believes is necessary and appropriate to protect public health. If a firm refuses to recall, FDA can pursue a remedy in federal court like a seizure, but this can be time-consuming and cumbersome. Under current authorities, when the product has already been widely distributed to hundreds of retail stores, the agency would have to undertake hundreds of separate seizures in order to ensure that all violated product has been removed from the market.
Mr. Chairman, could I ask unanimous consent that the entire statement be placed in the record so we can get to Q&A? We have received it.
Without objections, your entire statement will be included in the record. Okay. So if you just would summarize it so we can move on.
Sure. I'm sorry. I just have two more sentences.
Sure.
The events of the phantom recall raises important questions about the current voluntary recall system. In this case, if FDA had the authority simply to order a recall to be done in the right way, I do not believe these events would have occurred. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I'm ready for questions.
Thank you very much. Let me thank you for your statement, Dr. Scharfstein. Let me begin by asking, did the FDA approve Johnson & Johnson's phantom recall of Motrin?
No. To start, the FDA doesn't approve recalls. It is in the discretion of the company. But the second thing I think that's very important is the phantom part of the phantom recall. And this was part of my testimony previously, relates to the fact that there were contractors going out telling people to act like regular customers and not really tell the truth about what they're doing in the stores. And based on what I know, based on the documents that I reviewed, I don't see any indication that FDA was aware at the time that those types of activities were going on or approved.
Right. Are you familiar with the soft market withdrawal term?
I'm not familiar with that term.
When Johnson & Johnson sent the FDA a letter April 2009 talking about buying defective Motrin, why didn't the FDA become concerned and take action right away? I mean, what led to the delay?
Well, I think that's a very fair question for the committee to ask. That report disclosed that McNeil was retrieving product that failed specifications, and removing the product was the right thing for McNeil to be doing. But what it didn't say in that report was that they were, all it said was we were going to retrieve it from the shelves, or however they phrased it. It didn't say that they would be telling people to act like regular customers or not disclosing the facts when they were asked about what happened when they went out. I think that in part because there was limited information that might have contributed to the delay, but I also think that FDA should have been asking questions right away and figured out what the agency eventually figured out, that this really did need to be registered as a real recall.
What went wrong that caused Johnson and Johnson's recall of 135 million bottles of children's medicine? And is the FDA satisfied with what Johnson & Johnson is doing to solve the problem? Are you satisfied with Johnson & Johnson?
Sure. So what went wrong there? There's sort of the notes in the music. You know, the notes are the specific details and the inspectional observations, the fact that there were batches that were super potent or batches that may have had particles or an issue with how they investigated and responded to potential bacterial contamination. But the music is that the company had an inadequate quality system, and that you could see in multiple facilities. FDA is both responding to the notes in the music. You've heard from the testimony there are major changes at McNeil. FDA has been very involved in ensuring that those are the right kinds of changes, and FDA is committed to making sure when this facility is up and running that it is in compliance. So we are comfortable with where things are now. We appreciate the commitment of McNeil and Johnson & Johnson's leadership to fixing the problem, but this is a very serious problem, and we are not going to take anything for granted.
Right. Let me ask, does the FDA need more enforcement authority or funding to be able to respond to issues like the Johnson & Johnson recall? This bothers me in terms of for something like this to happen, and we're concerned about safety. Does FDA need additional authority? In other words, what is the problem?
Right. Well, I think there are a couple things. This has to be put in the context that FDA did identify these lapses before there was a serious health consequence. We are not finding that there are serious illnesses or deaths linked to this problem. And the agency, through its inspections and through multiple meetings with the company and aggressive, extraordinary meetings with the company, has brought about tremendous change in this area. Having said that, all of us want to prevent these things, and we want to be responding much faster in some cases than even what happened here. And I think that the issues of resources and authority are very fair questions. I testified that if FDA had mandatory recall authority, I think things would have gone a lot different.
Well, now how are you working with Johnson & Johnson to correct this and to make certain it doesn't happen again?
How are we working?
Yes.
It's both at the individual facility level and at the corporate level. So we're helping them with the individual quality issues that they had, as well as how they structure their quality program to make sure that the kinds of lapses that they had don't happen again.
On that note, my time has expired. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, the ranking.
No. Please go to Mr. Chaffetz.
Ms. Chaffetz, okay. Gentleman from Utah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Doctor, for being here. Ms. Torres, can you help explain to me what is her current status? Has she been fired? Has she been demoted? Did she get promoted? What's her current status?
I understand she is still the district director in San Juan, Puerto Rico.
And so you found that she's done nothing inappropriate? She acted just the way she should have?
No.
You feel totally comfortable with the way she acted?
No, I would say that this is a matter that's under investigation. We are looking at what happened here. As I testified, things should have happened sooner on FDA's part. That's something that we're looking at. And based on what we find and conclude, that could lead to different changes at FDA.
Is there an opportunity for this committee to interact with her? Is there any reason there's a hesitation on part of FDA to make her available for questioning by the committee?
Well, as you know, I think that I know at least the minority staff had requested to speak with her, and FDA declined. FDA declined at the instruction of the Department of Justice because she is a witness, a central witness in a related criminal investigation.
When you say related criminal investigation, is that related to Johnson & Johnson in this case or related to some other group or product? Or
no, I believe it's related to this. I believe it's related to this.
Related to this. Is it your common practice or recommendation to not make field staff and people who are closest to these situations available to the committee?
No, my view as former staff member of this committee is that, that Congress should get as much information as possible. I think,
so is it your personal recommendation that she should be made available to this
committee? But I also recognize the importance of the integrity in criminal investigations.
Why would a criminal investigation be slowed down by her appearing before this committee or even simply meeting with staff from both the Republican and Democratic sides of the aisle?
Well, I don't think that that's a judgment that FDA should make. And what we did is we turned to the Department of Justice and their career prosecutors, and we got instructions from them. And they said that it would be a problem, and that's why. But I'm not a lawyer. I don't know these cases, so I can't really comment. But basically, we're relying on the Department of Justice.
I think there is a frustration, if I can express it, at least from this member, that she should be made available. The other staff that are there in the field office should be made available in the spirit of full disclosure in what's happening. I am a bit troubled by this Elaine, and again, I'm slaughtering people's names here. Elaine Bobo, is that how you pronounce her name? She is the FDA spokesperson, and very recently she said, it appeared in the Wall Street Journal and the Associated Press and Reuters, quote, any effort to suggest that the FDA had knowledge of the phantom recall is based on quoting documents selectively and out of context and ignores other evidence as to what occurred. McNeil's own written account of its communications with the FDA does not support the conclusion that McNeil disclosed the activities associated with its phantom recall to the FDA.
Right.
End quote. I have a problem believing that, and I'm troubled when the FDA puts out such a dramatic statement. And yet, we got a whole host of information here that suggests otherwise.
If I'd be happy to try to clarify that and explain. What I believe people were alleging, or there were questions coming to the agency, was that we knew about the surreptitious nature of the recall, the phantom part of the phantom recall. That people were out there acting like regular customers, not telling the truth when asked. And there isn't, in anything that I've seen or anything before the committee, evidence that FDA knew about that. Okay, I think that's what she was responding to. Now, go ahead.
When we use the term recall, that has some very specific implications. I mean, it is a term, right? It is a very specific term that has a great deal of definition to it in the world of the FDA and certainly the companies that you interact with. So if a company came and said, we're conducting a recall, you would have a pretty good sense of what they're going to do, right? I mean, am I off base in saying that?
Not all recalls are the same. They then have to file a form which goes through all the specifics.
Okay,
and
so
there can be a fair amount of variability in a recall.
So I'm looking at this field action report, which is dated April 21st of 2009, and part of what was submitted said, the product from the subject lots found in the stores was removed during the visits. Visits to the remaining retailers will be completed by July 15, 2009 to remove any product from the subject lots that is found.
Correct.
They didn't say they were doing a recall. They said they were going back and getting look, I'm not trying to excuse their action. We just heard testimony from them saying we didn't do this right.
Right, and I want to be clear. FDA was informed of exactly that in April 21st.
And how does the FDA spokesperson come out and say we didn't know anything about this?
I think the difference is what she was referring to is that what she's saying FDA didn't know, and I still don't see any evidence of, is didn't know about the surreptitious lying part of the recall. That it wasn't
a recall. That's, I guess,
of the events. Okay, and that is still not in the documents where people are being instructed to say things that aren't true. We all agree,
but what my concern is, and
that's not in that document.
What I would appreciate you looking back and considering
right.
is that the FDA statement was very strong, saying, "Oh no, you cannot construe." There was evidence that you should have looked deeper into that. When they say they're not doing a recall, then I think the FDA has some obligation to probe a little bit further, maybe ask a few questions. And you admitted that they came to the party late in this regard. Let me read a couple quick quotes, because I cited them earlier. This is from internal J&J documents. Quote, FDA is really bending the rules in this case because of the fact that we stopped distribution a while ago. How do you, I mean, so for the FDA to go take a real strong stance and saying, oh, we knew nothing about this, but then we have documents back from March 24th of 2009 saying the FDA is really bending the rules.
Here's what I can explain I think that one means, because I'm familiar with that. That was referring to the fact that we weren't ordering a recall without even the check. That is my understanding of that document. And that when he says because we just, basically a product that is violative and on the market should be recalled. But the company came to us and said, we don't think any's out there. Now, they said that to us, even though their own documents here indicate, I believe, that they knew that there was some out there. But they said very specifically, and in fact, if you look at the March 23rd FAR, they were saying, there's none out there, there's none out there. They used that argument, and FDA's district office said, well, if there's none out there, you don't need to do a recall. He interpreted that as bending the rules, but in fact, our regulations permit, if there's none out there, not to have a recall.
Mr. Chairman, let me just make this last comment, and I will yield back. I think it is irresponsible for the FDA to put out a public statement when the documentation shows that it wasn't a quote-unquote recall, that there is a criminal investigation in place, that there are internal documents that demonstrate there were many discussions with the FDA. I think you had plenty of reasons to not attack the committee for the testimony that we were able to draw out during the previous testimony, but you essentially came out just a couple, literally days ago, and attack the credibility of what this committee is trying to do. And really what we're trying to do is inform the public and let them help, participate in this and come to their own conclusion. There was plenty of evidence from multiple sources that did not warrant the strong statement that came from the FDA. That's part of my point. I'd appreciate your consideration looking at that moving forward. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, gentleman, for his questioning. Now yield to the gentleman from Maryland, Congressman Cummings.
Thank you very much. I think, first of all, I want to thank the gentleman who just asked questions. I thought he asked a great set of questions, and as I was looking at the document that he was referring to, Dr. Sharfstein, there is a sentence here that said the assessment performed demonstrated that on a statistical basis, a low amount, approximately 1% of the batches, is potentially still at the retail level. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
Now, what did that say to you all? I mean, so you didn't think it was that much out there?
That's correct. And in fact, if the month before, in the March version of the same document, it actually said it is expected that none of the affected lots are available at the store level. And at the same time, there's several documents that have emerged through the committee's investigation that they were expecting to find more. And in fact, they found more. And I'll read you one of the emails that was on April 16th prior to the submission of that. And it said, we found 264 units of the impacted lots, which would project there's potentially 5,280 units across the 5,000 stores, or 6.3% of the total product manufactured and shipped. Now, which goes on to say why she thinks...
And this, but this was not information that you all had at the time.
As far as I can see in the documents, this information was not shared with the FDA.
Now, Dr. Sharfstein, buried in the field alert report dated April 21st, 2009, there's a brief statement that, and I quote, the product from the subject lots found in stores was removed during the visits. How would the FDA normally interpret a statement like that? And how would most companies normally remove product from stores if they were conducting a product recall? And how would the FDA and general public be informed?
Right. Well, I think that's an excellent question. I spoke last night to the head of enforcement and the Office of Regulatory Affairs and FDA, and he said that he'd looked at that report and that line, and he said it was an unremarkable line, that's the kind of thing that companies do as part of recalls. They go out and they get the product. But what's remarkable is the phantom part, that they were concealing it when they went out, and that's not in there. And he said that's remarkable. What's in the report is not remarkable. And
so let me make sure I know what you're talking about. as you heard, McNeil instructed their contractor, Inmar, to quote, simply act like a, quote, regular customer, unquote, while making these purchases. They are also told, and quote, there must be no mention of this being a recall of the product. So when you say you didn't know about the phantom part, that's what you mean.
That's
Is that what
exactly right. Mm-hmm.
I see. So just for clarification, then, you thought there is a situation where something was not dissolving properly, and no one was under the impression, that is FDA, was that it could be harmful to somebody that would buy it. Is that a fair statement?
Not pose a safety problem, but it wouldn't necessarily be as effective as it should be.
Say that again?
We didn't think that it caused a safety problem, but
Right.
we agreed that it might not be as effective
I see.
as it should be because it was less medicine in the pill, basically.
Now, did you all know they were going into 40 states to do this phantom recall?
All we knew, I don't know if I can answer that completely other than to point to that document. That's what we were told, that they were going to retrieve it. But I think that what's clear, and this is where I believe that FDA could have done better, is that document doesn't say a whole lot. And we should have been asking questions then to really understand more. We eventually did ask those questions. We eventually did find out about the phantom part of the phantom recall. And then we called, the agency called the company to account for it, and that's why we're here.
Now, Dr. Sharfstein, let me ask you this. You're admitting that the FDA did not do all it should have done. Is that right?
That's correct.
But we don't want to take light off of the fact that McNeil and J&J could have done better too. Is that right?
Well, I think fundamentally the responsibility is with the company to have handled their quality problems in a much different way.
But as Mr.
And FDA did respond and did identify these problems. I think we always have to ask ourselves whether we could have done so fast.
And that leads me to my final question. How do we know that we now have an FDA and the department that deals with this that would deal with it differently and would deal with it in a way that would cause that trust to come to citizens of our country who might be buying the product?
That's a fair question. I think I would point in part to all the work that we've done with these companies since this came to light. And I would also say that Dr. Hamburg, the commissioner, and I are absolutely committed to strengthening the enforcement and the oversight of FDA. I've actually invited here today our new head of enforcement, Dara Corrigan, a former acting HHS Inspector General. This is her first week on the job, and I asked her to come to understand what had gone on in this case and the need, as she works and establishes leadership over this part of FDA, the need for us to do everything we can.
Could she raise her hand so we'll at least know who you're talking about? Oh, there you are. All right. Welcome. Congratulations. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Right. And let me also welcome you. Thank you. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentlewoman from Washington, D.C., Congresswoman Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Sharfstein, I was really interested in Mr. Weldon's answer to my question regarding the children's medicines and the 8 million bottles, and I'd like your opinion. This was my question to him, predicated on the McNeil document that showed contamination growth identified in children's medicine in April 2008. And I wanted to know from him whether or not he should have recalled, not in 2009, but earlier. And he indicated that they had looked at those samples and that there was no contaminant in those samples. Is that your view?
It's true that it basically relates to what I would call a super lot of this substance, meaning a huge batch, and the sublots. So the super lot was known to have some contamination in it. And I understand that the company knew that the certain sublots that were contaminated they didn't use. Other sublots they tested and didn't find a problem, and they used those. But FDA's view was that testing alone doesn't give you enough confidence of safety if the whole super lot has had a problem.
So what should be done?
So what should have been done was basically recall it, and that's why it eventually got recalled. But this isn't just FDA's view. This is what we believe that their good manufacturing practices required. So and it relates to the concept that if you can't test quality into something, if you know that something is of poor quality, you can't keep testing it to find the little part to use. If there's a problem overall, you can't use it.
And I would think especially with children's medicines of various kinds. I must say that what it does show is that a company will act, I think, quite normally, absent regulations. It will draw the presumption in favor of itself. I noticed that on page 5 of your own testimony, you say something that I would regard as a truism. The current voluntary system of drug recall depends on companies providing accurate and complete information to the agency and recalling adulterated or otherwise violative products in a prompt and appropriate manner. Now, the voluntary system would assume all of that to be the case, but I must say that it makes the same kind of assumption that was made for 10 years about the financial system, that voluntarily letting them go without regulations will do it. In the same way, this voluntary recall notion is not only an oxymoron. I don't see how we can continue to abide it and expect companies to act any way but the way people do, to protect themselves, to protect their shareholders. And the only way to pierce that is with some kind of form of regulation. If we haven't learned that from financial reform, and now we've got to learn it from children's medicine, we'll never learn it. I want to ask you about the phantom recall of defective Motrin. Do you believe, Dr. Sharpstein, that the companies adequately informed FDA about the defective Motrin issues beginning in November 2008?
I believe that we knew that there was a defective Motrin issue. The company did inform us that there was a defective Motrin issue in November 2008. I do not think that we were adequately informed about what the company knew about whether it was still on the shelves. Because at the same time the company was telling FDA they didn't think any was on the shelves, they were internally expecting to find
some on the shelves.
Some on the shelves. So I don't think that was adequate information to the agency. I think that might have been one of the contributing factors to the delay.
And of course, although they have a duty to do that, since it's only a voluntary duty, there was nothing you could do about it.
Right. And I also don't believe, based on the information that I have available, that the company informed FDA about the phantom part of the phantom recall, the surreptitious nature, the act like a regular employee, don't tell people what you're doing, part of the recall. I do not see in any of these documents evidence that FDA was informed about that at that time.
I see my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Right. And now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, the ranking member of the committee, Congressman Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Doctor, I earlier in my opening statement referenced your old boss, Mr. Chairman Waxman, because I do think that he was right when he said that we had a constitutional obligation and we weren't meeting it. But I want to be true to his words and ask you, it's hard to get a notebook like this 4 inches thick. This is the record of your agency's inspections without shutting down that plant. Now, you're coming here today and you're saying, I need new authority, I need mandatory recall authority. You may get it. But you had the ability to shut down the factory. Anytime you found anything, you could pull the switch and shut them down. This is how many times you visited and visited and visited. Under Chairman Waxman's tenure, you're working on the committee. But more importantly, under the Bush administration, this was not dealt with. Of course, it was the same people. Under your administration, this was not dealt with. This was the record of failure before we got to the recall. Now, you haven't been on the job more than about 2 years, but I assume you've read your regulatory procedure manual, 7-3, which talks about your recall procedures, statutory recall procedures? Okay, well, let's go through it by the numbers and make sure we understand. Your people in Puerto Rico were participants in a stealth recall. The evidence shows that they understood product was being taken. I'll agree with you, subject to criminal investigation that's going on, that they may not have known that it was being bought without saying that, in fact, it was being recalled. But, of course, remember, your people had agreed that it wasn't a recall, and yet they were agreeing that it was going to be removed from the shelves. So, while the FDA was aware product was being assessed and removed from the shelf, they were not asking for a recall. They were not, in fact, doing what they already have a responsibility according to your manual, which was to agree to public statements, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if they didn't have the right to do a recall, but they knew product was being recalled, then they did not participate in how that recall that wasn't a recall was going to be done. In fact, if anything, well, they knew that product was being removed by a third-party contractor. They didn't ask, they didn't tell, like the three monkeys that you see, hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. They failed to do their job because they had an obligation and a manual that told them how to do that. Isn't that correct, that the fact that they didn't know how it was being removed was because they knew it was being removed and didn't ask and did not assert any of the procedures in your manual?
Let me thank you for your questions, and I respect the importance of oversight. And
I'd like a yes or no on that. Did they, in fact, according to the evidence, no product was being removed from the shelf and did not assert in any documents you have? Remember, because of the criminal investigation, we're almost opaque relative to the FDA.
Did assert that this needed to be recalled in July, but it did not happen before that. And one of the things that I
but they were informed that product was being removed from the shelf. That's in the emails. And your people. No, wait a second. That your people did a press release, a press statement, implying that we weren't doing our jobs and we were misleading the public when, in fact, you may not have known what was being said as they purchased the product, but your people knew they purchased the product, and there was ongoing dialogue to that extent. Isn't that true?
It's true that we knew that they were purchasing the product.
Okay,
that was
so now you know there's a recall going on. Purchasing back the product is a recall, isn't it? Call it whatever you want. Isn't it a recall?
It's a component of a recall.
Okay, so they're purchasing back the product. You're not doing a public statement to encourage people to return product so it can be bought back at those consumer areas. You're not doing any of the things that are in your manual, and yet you want us to believe that it's all Johnson & Johnson. Look, Johnson & Johnson,
not what I
no, wait a second. Johnson & Johnson made bad product. They made product that was not efficacy, was not working up to its standard. But yet you want us to believe that it's all their fault and that Ms. Torres, who's still on the job but under criminal investigation, is in fact somehow to be given a pass here, and you're to be given new authority when I've got 4 inches of authority that you didn't assert.
Right. Well, with all respect, that's not what I testified. I did not testify this was all Johnson & Johnson's fault.
Well, what changes have you made or are you prepared to make at FDA to prevent this from happening again at the other 14 plants in Puerto Rico? 35 plants in Puerto Rico.
Can I finish my previous
Please.
thought? That FDA identified the problem and in July was very clear with the company. What I testified...
Well, no, in July. No, they were told by the company of this problem prior to that in the whole process.
FDA instructed the company to register this as a recall in July. I could read you the email.
That's 6 or 7 months after they were aware of the problem and after it was all removed from the shelf.
And I testified that that instruction should have come earlier. But it was because of that instruction that it got into the FDA enforcement bulletin.
Well, isn't it true that it's not on your website today? It's not a listed recall?
That's not true.
We looked for it. We could not find it. Would you please make it available to the committee?
I'll give it to you right now if you want it. It is in the enforcement report of November 25th, 2009.
No, I asked about your website where you list public recalls.
This is on this. I mean, I got a printout, it looks like, from a website right here listing it. So, I mean, I'm happy to show it to you. It sure looks like a printout from a website. So,
oh, I'm sorry, but we do have. We'll provide you with our website that it's supposed to be on, that it's not on, and we can compare that for the record later.
Yeah, I mean, I was given a report printed out from a website. So we'll figure out what's going on there. FDA realizes it is a critical responsibility, not just to the facilities in Puerto Rico, the facilities elsewhere in the United States, but all around the world that are shipping drugs, foods, other things into our country. This is extremely important. That's why the Commissioner has made a priority of enforcement, and it's why we're pleased that there is an entire now business within the private sector to train companies to meet FDA specifications for compliance. It is both an FDA responsibility, it is also a corporate responsibility. We have to do everything we can in a changing and very difficult environment to protect the public.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I know my time has expired, so for the record, I would like a complete answer to this, and that is, since the discovery of this pesticide used on the wood, and you testified that in fact they, if you will, they had failed to meet their responsibility, would you explain for the record why you did a notification to an industry of a new and novel problem after the fact that was discovered by Johnson & Johnson, reported by Johnson & Johnson, and fixed by Johnson & Johnson, if you will, and yet you put it out to an industry that was completely unaware of it, and you want us to believe that somehow it was a failure of a company, when in fact it was a discovery not previously known by any of the manufacturers in the industry. And I'd like that completely answered for the record, because I find an inconsistency between your implying that a terrible thing to discover had happened, but that somehow you guys were the cure, rather than, in fact, all you did was take their work and publicize it to an industry that otherwise would not have been made aware of it. Yield back.
I'd be happy to answer that question initially, but I'll leave it to you.
This is the second round. I'd love to hear it.
Let me, then there will not be a second round, so maybe you could answer it at this time, and even though your time has long expired, but you could answer it at this moment.
It's okay. It's what I deserve for having been on the committee as staff. That's many minutes of questions. What FDA objected to with respect to the smell and the TBA was not so much that there was a new problem that the company found, but that they had identified a problem and not reported it for quite some time. And then it was the FDA pushing them to investigate it further that led them to discover the problem. So if the company had come to us and said, we found a problem, we would be saying, that's terrific. You found a problem. It may be applicable in other places. Thanks for having a system that finds that. Instead, there were problems. Many months went by before a report came into FDA. When that happened, we felt the company wasn't pursuing it diligently enough. FDA was on top of it. And as a result of that, we got those recalls. We learned and we informed the rest of the industry so that we could be on top of an emerging problem. And I think that speaks to a bigger point.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate his answer, and I think it's a good one, but it flies in the face of when you discover new science, the expectation that you're going to report it within 3 days in a meaningful way begs the question of if the FDA can't even make up its mind on a July report that they're still evaluating 60 days later and said that they're not prepared to talk about. I'm seeing a pattern that we expect corporations to respond to new science discoveries in 3 days. And then so that everyone knows, it's very clear that we do need to have reporting. I think Johnson & Johnson appropriately was wrong not to at least give a heads up. But let's be honest, this was new science that needed discovery that has benefited all the industry so that we make better product. And I think 3 days is a nice time to say, oh, we found something that might be interesting.
Mr. Chairman, regular
order.
All they found. Mr. Chairman, regular order.
Let me just say this, and based on what the gentleman's saying, seemed like he wants to support my legislation. And of course, therefore, I now yield to Ms. Watson for 5 minutes.
I do hope that so. Excuse me. Dr. Sharpstein, Johnson & Johnson has described as our chairman has described, rightfully dubbed the phantom recall of the adult Motrin products as merely an assessment to determine how much product was in circulation. However, we knew this is not accurate because they proceeded to remove the product from the stores without informing customers or retailers of the defective product. What is this a typical kind of thing that happens, and what steps should have Johnson & Johnson have taken when they discovered the dissolution problem with the Motrin? Is this something that occurs often?
No, well, this is a very unusual set of circumstances, and that's why when FDA really understood what was going on, there was an extraordinary meeting with the parent company, Johnson & Johnson, to express concern about it. To your point, what should happen is when there's a product that's out of specification, there's a prompt notification to the agency and a recall, an official registered recall. And in this case, there was, because they had stopped selling it before, they made the case to the agency that there wasn't any out there and there might not need to be a recall. Although, as I've said, I'm concerned, based on some of the documents the committee has gotten, that that wasn't, necessarily a fair representation to the agency, because they were sort of seemed to know that there was stuff out there. And that was sort of one of the steps that led this to take a lot longer than it should have. But I also acknowledge that FDA could have done more to make this happen sooner.
During our previous hearing on this subject, it was reported that from January 1, 2008 through April 30th, 2010, that 775 adverse events had been reported for children who took the recalled products. And at the time, the FDA could not confirm whether or not there was a direct causal link between these events and the recall drugs. But I think it's important that we fully investigate the effects these contaminated or super potent drugs could have on children. So has the FDA been investigating the adverse events report, and if so, how? Would you elaborate a bit?
Sure. I believe that there was a team in the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology that pulled all the adverse events for the recall products for 2 years prior to the recall and then 2 months after, and reviewed them and did not find that there was evidence establishing a link. Now, that was one of the things that was done. In other specific cases, FDA actually went out where there was a coroner, for example, who had a sample and was concerned, and we tested the sample and we didn't find it in any of the samples. So everything that we could do, we've done to try to assess this. There was, a very small risk, but we did not see evidence in these reports that there were serious illnesses or deaths.
Do you have any reasons to believe that these adverse events were related to the recall medications, and what are the most common adverse events that children have experienced because of the use?
Well, most of the adverse events that are because of the medication themselves. We couldn't find any serious adverse events related to the problems in production. So, each of those different kinds of medicines has their own series of adverse events that are on the label. So, some medicines might make, a child jittery potentially. There are a list of things that could happen, and those are the kinds of reports that we got. In other cases, people might take, mistakenly an overdose, too much of a medicine, and have an adverse event related to that. But that's not because of the quality problem in production. That just happens. All medicines carry risks. So those were the kinds of things that were being reported to the agency, not things that we could track to the quality problems that were at issue.
In my last 30 seconds, I'm addressing the chair. Mr. Chair, does your bill address this kind of thing? What are the adverse effects and how typical? Would your bill address that? Is there a provision?
It will address it, and also it's still open for amendments and suggestions.
Very good. We'd like to submit. Thank you very much.
And we're in need of co-sponsors.
I'll yield back. You'll have one.
Thank you very much. Let me thank the lady for her comments. And let me just say to you, Dr. Sharfstein, thank you so much for your testimony. I also want to thank Mr. Weldon and Ms. Goggins for staying and listening to your testimony. I think you're the appropriate person to do this because you're a pediatrician, aren't you?
I am.
Yeah, so you're the right person to talk to in reference to this issue. So I want to thank you for that. And I also want to let the members know that the record will be open for several days. We have not come up with the amount of days, but there are certain questions that, of course, that members wanted to submit for the record, and of course, we will leave it open to get those questions. Again, I want to thank you for being here, and I want to thank all the members for their participation. On that note, the committee stands adjourned.
Next on C-SPAN.
For children. Yet, despite the hearing earlier this year, there's some very concerning issues that have come to light. I'm very disappointed that the FDA has evidently not given us access to the people on the ground, in Puerto Rico in particular, that have firsthand knowledge of what's happening. I simply do not understand why the San Juan District Director is not made available, as she would provide the best, most comprehensive type of information given the direct nature in which she's been involved. And I think we need to further explore that, Mr. Chairman. And then within the Johnson & Johnson, I want to read some quotes from emails. And if you spend time in your testimony giving us platitudes and, reading things that some corporate communications person wrote, I think you're going to see a frustrated group of members. When we read quote, and these are quotes from within Johnson & Johnson to other Johnson & Johnson employees, quote, FDA is really bending the rules in this case, the Motrin caplet case, because of the fact that we stopped distribution a while ago, end quote. In another email, quote, regarding FDA documents, all my conversation with the FDA director, Ms. Torres, here in Puerto Rico have been off the record since I cannot quote her. This happens due to my good relationship with her. That's why we are doing something very different. Quote, from another email, the district director is already sticking her neck out as her boss in Washington is more in favor of a recall, end quote. We need some answers from Johnson & Johnson's, and we need some answers from the FDA, because the candor has not been there. It has not been there. This committee has an obligation to the American people to get to the bottom of this. And there's some funny business happening here, and nobody's happy about it. Please, don't just read some testimony that gives us platitudes. Answer these questions. They're serious. And there are millions of Americans that are relying upon the answers to these questions. But based on the evidence that we're starting to see more and more of, it looks like there was much too much of a cozy relationship that does not give the confidence to the American people to buy your products and to insist and make sure that the FDA is actually doing its job. I yield back.
I'd like to thank the gentleman from Utah for his statement. I now yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Congressman Kucinich.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to associate myself with the remarks of Mr. Chaffetz. We don't know if it's in this case, but there are so many areas where regulators and the regulated have a cozy relationship which works to the detriment of the American people. I mean, we need only to look to the BP oil catastrophe to have that underlined boldly. And there sadly are many other examples. We'll find out if that's the case here. But I want to caution some of my colleagues about how we define the work of this committee. Because on one hand, some of my colleagues would reject a beneficial role for government in people's lives. And on the other hand, when a regulatory agency does attempt to assert government responsibility for corporate misconduct, that's not recognized.
Weldon testified before a House Oversight Committee about the recall of over 135 million bottles of infant and children's medicines earlier this year. He's joined by the FDA's Principal Deputy Commissioner. This was the second hearing the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee has held on the recall. It's 2 hours, 15 minutes.
Committee will come to order. Johnson & Johnson's recall of children's Tylenol and other children's medicines and the phantom recall of Motrin. Good morning, and thank you all for being here. This is our second hearing on disturbing recall of children's medicine by Johnson & Johnson. At our first hearing, we learned that J&J's April the 30th recall of children's Tylenol, children's Motrin, children's Benadryl, and Tylenol infants drops was the largest recall of children's medicine in history. More than 135 million bottles of children's medicines were recalled. We also learned that there wasn't just one recall. We heard testimony about rolling recalls, a phantom recall, a plant shutdown, and management firings since then. We have obtained additional documents which raise troubling questions about both the accuracy of J&J's earlier testimony and the extent of the phantom recall. When Johnson & Johnson learned it had a problem with one of its adult Motrin products in 2008 and 2009, the company hired contractors to go into stores and buy the product off the shelves without saying it was a recall, so that the public and the news media would know what was really happening. When J&J was asked about this phantom recall at our first hearing and about the behavior of its contractors, we were basically told that J&J did not know what the contractors were doing. However, documents subsequently obtained by the committee shows that J&J dictated how the phantom recall would be carried out. Internal emails and other documents indicate that J&J clearly knew what it was doing and why. For example, referring to the problems with Motrin that resulted in the phantom recall, one McNeil executive said, "We are just trying to prevent a recall and a lot of expended dollars." In another email, McNeil executive referred to the phantom recall and says, "This was a major win for us as it limits the press that will be seen." Finally, it appears the president of the company gave the go-ahead for the phantom recall, saying, "Let's make this happen as soon as possible." Perhaps we can clear up this apparent discrepancy between J&J testimony in May and the documents that have come to light since that time. J&J has said the FDA knew about and approved the phantom recall, but FDA says that isn't true. Both sides will have an opportunity to tell their side of the story today. But even if the FDA was technically aware of it, that does not excuse what Johnson & Johnson did. Johnson & Johnson had both the legal and moral obligation to do the right thing, and they did not. There are also new questions. Our investigations has uncovered documents that show J&J hired the phantom recall contractors to perform work related to children's Tylenol. In light of what we know now about the phantom recall of adult Motrin, I think J&J has a duty to fully explain how it handled problems with children's medicine. Finally, the troubling issues about rolling recalls and phantom recalls that this hearing examined makes one point very, very clear. Even if the FDA had been notified about the Motrin problem, the agency did not have the legal authority to order a recall. This needs to be rectified. The FDA needs mandatory recall authority, which we've been pushing for. I think most people would be surprised to learn that the FDA, the agency that is responsible for ensuring drug safety, has no power to order a company to recall its defective drugs. This is why I introduced a bill that would give the FDA mandatory recall authority. Hopefully, we can avoid future phantom recalls and empower the FDA to take action to protect the American people. Both Johnson & Johnson and the FDA will be asked questions today, and I hope they are prepared to give us the answers that we need to make certain that the drugs that are on the shelf are safe. On this note, I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, the ranking member, Congressman Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this important second hearing on the failure of FDA regulators of the Johnson & Johnson failure to protect the American people. I think it is critical for us today to understand that Johnson & Johnson and its subsidiaries do not get a pass for failing to meet the high standards expected of their company through their long history. That failure will mar Johnson & Johnson's image for many years to come. No matter how much they correct it, they will live with the repercussions of their failures. But the American people will also, at the end of these hearings, recognize that government has failed to do its job. FDA's explanation appears to include seemingly false statements to this committee in April of this year. Given the documents received by the committee, it demonstrates the FDA was in fact aware that Johnson & Johnson's quiet recall of adult Motrin products, something they led us to believe they were not. Even if we gave them additional authority for mandatory recalls, if they were complicit in a silent recall, then to what end would that new authority be? Mr. Chairman, fundamental concerns of this committee are making government
name, oversight and government reform. I want you to know that. Now you call on the gentleman from Maryland for 3 minutes, Congressman Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I thank you for convening this very important follow-up hearing to consider the safety of medications for children and families. And I'm extremely troubled by what appears to be an egregious pattern of behavior on the part of Johnson & Johnson and their subsidiary McNeil Consumer Healthcare. And as I listen to Mr. Issa, I must say that I think we need to reserve judgment because the FDA, the principal deputy commissioner Sharfstein, will be testifying. And I know him to be a very, he was head of Baltimore's health department, and I can think of no one with more integrity and more, has put more effort into protecting the safety of our fellow citizens. Now, the Johnson & Johnson website states that, quote, the values that guide our decision-making are spelled out in our credo. Put simply, our credo challenges us to put the needs and well-being of the people we serve first. Living these values, McNeil Consumer Healthcare and Johnson & Johnson were lauded for their efforts recalling Tylenol and temporarily stopping advertising when lives were on the line due to cyanide contamination in 1982. The recent events could not be more different. One day after our last hearing, Blacksmith Brands recalled Pediacare because the products were manufactured by McNeil Healthcare, even though McNeil officials had said that they did not manufacture products for other companies. Yet, it doesn't stop there. In June and July 2010, McNeil Healthcare twice expanded their original January 15, 2010 recall because of TBA contamination, a pesticide and flame retardant. Why exactly were these items not identified 6 months prior in the original recall? Perhaps most disturbing, McNeil's Consumer Healthcare and Johnson & Johnson conspired to put profits first. There is no other conclusion that simply can be drawn. McNeil hired contractors to simply act like regular customers when conducting a soft market withdrawal of tainted Motrin from over 4,000 convenience stores in more than 40 states. Any product that needs to be recalled through a phantom or a regular recall should not be in the hands of consumers and is probably unsafe. Revealing the true motivation for these events, McNeil President Peter Luther wrote on May 27, 2009, given our current financial situation, I hope we're not going to really double our costs to do this. Let's make this happen as soon as possible. Minutes later, J&J Vice President for Sales, Gary Benedict, responded via email that he wanted more information on the situation that day. These actions clearly show that McNeil and Johnson & Johnson knew the product was not safe and that they chose to make profits their first consideration over the safety of their constituents. And with that, I look forward to the testimony, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. I thank the gentleman from Maryland for his statement. I now yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Utah, Congressman Chafee.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for calling this hearing. Thank you all for being here today. Obviously, the American people rely upon the FDA to make sure that our country and our people and our children are safe and secure. We also rely upon big brand names, people like McNeil and Johnson & Johnson, to provide good quality products that families and mothers can use with their
government do its job. In the case of the FDA, that means making sure that those who regulate our food and drug supply are careful, thorough, and honest. Regrettably, the pattern emerging at FDA is one of carelessness, deficiencies, and untruthfulness. Now, this is the committee that has now that this committee has sufficient evidence of FDA failure, we must be committed to following up that investigation and its needed reforms. New authority may be part of it, but no amount of authority makes up for failure to do the job you already have authority for and responsibility. Now, Mr. Chairman, there are differences in views today on where this committee should focus its oversight. Well-intentioned men and women on both sides of a partisan aisle often disagree with the best of intentions. When we find agreement on our oversight responsibility, we should pursue them together. That is the case with the FDA and many other issues before this committee. In 2007, White House Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel, then Congressman from Chicago and head of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, described the important role of that this committee plays to ensure responsibility, accountability of government. He said, "We, the Democratic Party, want to be the party that is ferreting out waste and fraud, and the Oversight Committee is the point of the spear for us." Similarly, this committee's former chairman, my colleague from California, Mr. Waxman, noted that Congress does not always fulfill its duty to the American people to provide oversight of the administration. He said, "Congress has failed to meet this constitutional oversight responsibility. On issue after issue, the Congress has failed to conduct meaningful investigations of significant wrongdoing." I happen to agree with Mr. Waxman and Mr. Rahm Emanuel. These are constitutional obligations, and we must vigorously meet those responsibilities. Fortunately, the Chairman and I are pursuing a common investigation. It leads us to two sides and two failures. The public has a right to know how Johnson & Johnson got to this point, how they're going to get their reputation back by earning it with high-quality products that meet or exceed all standards. That's important, and it should be bipartisan. Mr. Chairman, today we also have to remember that our first part of our name, Government Oversight and Reform Committee, implies exactly what it means. We are overseeing government. Yes, we're also seeing when government fails in its interaction with business. We must, though, remember that our authority is to oversee and then reform. I, for one, in 2005, had the opportunity to oversee the Mineral Management Service and show that they were a dysfunctional organization, too cozy with those that they oversaw. Unfortunately, in the years that followed, we didn't have reform. And in 2010, the American people paid a high price for that failure to reform. When it comes to the FDA, we have seen the same thing, at least in this circumstance. We cannot fail to do that reform. We cannot wait for the American people to pay with their lives. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his statement, and I want you to know that we're going to live up to our